Hi, everyone. Thank you for that intro, Steve. Just for the record, my wife was absolutely fine with me speaking here, but Steve isn't for some reason. So anyway, right, it's been a super busy couple of days, hasn't it? I've had a fantastic time here. I hope you've all had a great time too, and hopefully you've got a few brain cells left for me. And thank you so much for sticking around and just being here. And thank you to the organisers of Agile on the Beach. I think they deserve a massive round of applause. Now, before I start, there's one other shout out I want to give, and that's to my son, Tom. So my son, Tom, is 11. Like most 11-year-olds, he's obsessed with two things, Minecraft and Lego. And I've managed to take advantage of that second obsession in here. So every bit of Lego, every picture you see in this presentation is Lego designed by Tom. So thank you, Tom. Right, so let's crack on. So let's get one thing out of the way first. So this is a story about teams and the value of teams at its real heart. So this is the one and only reference you will see to Ted Lasso in this presentation. Somebody went, ah. I'm also going to talk a little bit about glue as we go through. Now, if you want a presentation about glue and the value of glue work, this is the one to go to. It's absolutely exceptional. Now, this is really a presentation that came out of the story of a mistake. I'll call it the biggest mistake I've made as a fledgling engineering manager. So I took over a team, and there was this engineer in the team. We'll call him Bob. That obviously wasn't his real name. But Bob was just that engineer the stakeholders loved. So the stakeholders would come up with an idea. Bob would pick up the idea. Bob would code the idea. The stakeholder would get what they wanted. And I came in the team. I saw Bob. I thought, Bob's brilliant. Look what he can do. Stakeholders love him. They're going to love me as an engineering manager. But the longer I worked with the team, I saw that the team seemed to be somehow separated from Bob. Bob seemed a little bit distant. And I kind of asked around the team, like, what is it with Bob? And some of the responses I got were frankly quite shocking. So comments like, oh, I don't get Bob to review my PRs. His comments are vicious. And Bob asked me to test his work, but I had to spend 3 hours convincing him that the bugs that I found were actually real. And so I talked to Bob, because obviously that's what you do. And things improved for a little while, but there was a pattern, and we went back into the same pattern of explosion over a pull request or a comment. And so I went to my manager and I said, look, what is it with Bob? It's like, I've joined this team, I've taken this team over, I'm new to the company, Bob is here, he's obviously been here a while, and my manager said, that's just Bob. You've just got to find a way of accommodating Bob, because look what he does for the stakeholders. So I did. I kind of found Bob a place, quite sort of isolated in the code base, and where he could get on with his thing and the rest of the team could get on with theirs. And we went round and round the cycle of PR review, causes explosion, causes talk to Bob, da-da-da-da-da. And after a while, so a couple of years, Bob actually left the team. And you could see the team breathe a collective sigh of relief at that point. And then they started looking at the area of the code base that Bob was actually responsible for. And they found it was hacky, it was hard to understand, it was poorly tested. I mean, there hadn't been a handover, because after all, who would do a handover with Bob? And we ended up rewriting most of what Bob was responsible for. And it came out later that the team thought that I thought the way that Bob was working was okay, because I'd let it continue, even though I'd slightly isolated Bob. And it impacted the team, it impacted me. It was a mistake. Now, Bob was a rock star, right? And rock stars are not what teams need. So hello, this is little Lego me. Little Lego me is actually just down here keeping me company as well. So I'm not a rock star, don't worry. I can play the guitar badly, but don't worry, this is not going to be one of those presentations where I pull a guitar out from over here and start singing a happy clappy song about Agile. If you want to ask me any questions, I'm really happy to take questions at the end of this. Equally, if there isn't any time, these are my X's and blue skies for the 7 members of you that are probably on Blue Sky or LinkedIn. Steve is. Now, I'm the VP Engineering for a company called Bloom & Wild. So we are Europe's leading direct-to-consumer online flower company, where I lead the product and the platform engineering teams. We're a profitable B Corp. We do some really cool things with technology, particularly around our warehousing and fulfillment. And, well, I'm not really actually here to talk to you about flowers and about Bloom & Wild. I'm here to talk to you about what I feel is the future of teams. And some of the things that we've been doing in Bloom & Wild that I think are helping us under certain constraints to build and maintain engaged teams. So the main reason I'm here is because I'm worried. I'm concerned. I think we're beginning to value the rockstar persona again, and I don't think this is going to do our industry any good. Now, where does the rockstar persona come from? Like a lot of things in life, I think you can trace it back to money. So what you can see here is actually the historical UK interest rates since the 1980s. So you can see the 1980s and the 1990s, where everything was crazy. I mean, when I was putting this together, I had a newfound respect for my parents, who somehow managed to have a mortgage and pay off a mortgage in the 1980s and the 1990s. You can see the around 2000, the dot-com bubble bursting, a little bit of an impact there. That was the point at which I got my first proper software development job. Great timing, Janaway. But then what you can really see on this is you can see the impact of the 2008 financial crisis. So that happened here. So what happened at that point? In order to prop up economies, governments did 2 things. So they dropped the interest rates down to extremely low levels, and they did something else called quantitative easing. What quantitative easing effectively is printing money and pumping it into the economies to keep the economies afloat. Now, this had an impact, and it had an impact on the industry that we work in, because what happened then is, if you're a venture capitalist firm, you need to find a different way of making money when the interest rates are very, very low. So what happened is, VC funding started to get flooding into the market. So if you work for a startup or a scale-up, you've benefited from this. Because what you do is you bet big on, say, 100 companies. One of them comes off really big, 99 of them fail, but that's better than keeping your money in the bank. And so because so many ideas are realized with software, we all benefited. Great, right? Well, not totally. Because there wasn't a big cupboard of software engineers that you could suddenly open and fund and use to realize your ideas. So the number of roles exploded. Companies were opening everywhere. Demand started massively outstripping supply. This was what it was like looking for a software engineer in the mid-2010s. So we did some bad things. We got creative with job titles. We hired people just because they could code. We started to optimize our hiring processes for capability and not all the skills that you need to be a rounded software engineer. And we started to see things like salary and job title inflation. So this graph here actually shows the salary inflation for the lead engineer in the UK. So you can see a big peak there. That's just when the VC money started to flood into the market. So it took a couple of years after 2008. You can see some interesting other peaks, including one around COVID, and then perhaps one that's quite recent, which is interesting. And around this time, this is where this whole idea of rockstar developers came from. So you can see the number of searches on Google begin to go up for rockstar developer. Now, there's also a really interesting peak in this graph as well, over here. Now, I admit I have Googled rockstar developer a few times when preparing this talk. Not that many times. So there's something going on. And it's all beginning to get a little bit out of control. I mean, after all, this is real. I didn't make this up. What is a stud developer? As an aside, this is the most British response you will ever see, right? If anyone referred to me to be a stud developer, I'd be really embarrassed. Oh. This is what a hiring manager means when they say they're looking for a rockstar developer. But no, who are these rockstars? So there are certain traits that I would label a rockstar developer with. So as an example, they may be like Bob. They may write unmaintainable code. So they may be writing for themselves and not for others. They might be hoarding information. So knowledge is power, right? We all work with someone who loves being that center of power. Don't worry, I'll come in and save the day. But a big single point of failure. They might be somebody who avoids the boring sort of work, will only work on the most high profile and important projects for the company so that they can get all the kudos. And they're probably somebody that's strongly holding strong opinions. Now, talking about strong opinions, and strong opinions weakly held, seems our industry runs on two different catchphrases, this one and disagree and commit. Now, I find this one in particular quite interesting because this came about, so Stanford professor, technology forecaster, a guy called Paul Sappho came up with this as an ideology and a methodology. And it was all about using intuition to guide someone to a conclusion. Now, it's been really widely used. It's very, very good advice. But this is what he actually said. So he said lots of things. He said, allow your intuition to guide you to a conclusion no matter how imperfect. And then the weakly held bit, prove yourself wrong. So you may be engaging in creative doubt, looking for information that doesn't fit, for example. This is where your rock stars come in, because frequently that's where the problem is. It's not about disagreeing with you. It's about proving themselves wrong. Like Bob, for example. Bob couldn't bear to prove himself wrong. And that's why his opinions were so strongly held, and that's why he was isolated in the team. And as I learned, the sort of behavior of a rock star there is toxic. So making it harder for other people in the team to succeed, whether deliberately or by writing code which cannot be maintained or where that hasn't been handed over. It's that sort of behavior that causes people to leave. And if you're a manager of one of these people, the blast radius is high. So the example I gave where I had to keep going back and trying to coach Bob, that took a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of my time. You could ignore them like I did. That's a very, very big mistake. That's a very short-term approach. But you often have this problem. So you often have the problem where the stakeholders love folk like that because they just get stuff done. This is an education piece, right? So it's an education of the blast radius. It's an education piece around the over-reliance of putting all your eggs in one basket and building single points of failure. It's about team versus individual narratives. Now, there's a whole talk I could give you about this. It's called Why is Everything So Slow? It's on the Agile on the Beach YouTube channel, if you want to go and look. But before we go on, it's very, 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 very important to make a distinction here. So there is a clear distinction between a rock star and a great developer. So on the left here, we have a rock star. So the rock star is that one the stakeholders love and you don't know why. The one that's maybe perhaps building their own frameworks to solve a problem. I once came in and started managing a team where I had a front-end rockstar developer who had built his own middleware layer that sat between the website and the back end purely because he couldn't agree the communication protocol between the front end and the back end with another rockstar developer that was in the back end. One of the first things I did in that role was get the team to take the middleware out and got rid of the rockstar. But on the right, we have a great developer. And what the great developer does, when there's a problem, they come into the team, they work with the team, they pull what feels like a solution out of a hat, and then they work with and they coach the members of the team so that they can take over responsibility. And that's the key difference, right? You can't figure out what the guy on the left is doing, but when the girl on the left appears and gives you the solution, you face palm because you wish you'd thought of it yourself. And you can make a good differentiation in terms of performance using this. So this comes out of 5 dysfunctions of a team. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this before. So a high-performing team will show vulnerability. They'll engage in constructive debate. When there is decisions to be made, they will commit to them. And there's a culture of safety, which means they can hold their peers in the team accountable. Because ultimately what they are is they're focused on the team's success at heart. Equally, dysfunctional teams will conceal weakness. The culture is not safe. They'll avoid that kind of healthy debate. And that means the team often doesn't make decisions, or they appear to shun responsibility. And ultimately, it's prioritizing individuals' goals, like the goals of the rock star, over the goals of the team. And this is a really, really good framework to use. Your great developers sit here, your rock stars sit here. Now, I thought it was worth talking my favorite books on teams. One of these is very new, or relatively new. 2 of these are really quite old. And that's okay. We work in an industry that, in the grand scheme of things, is still quite young. But what else makes great teams? So great teams, as we saw from the 5 dysfunctions of a team model, have a high level of trust. Often they have a mix of seniority in the team. This means that a mix of different sorts of work can be done in the team, and it means there's the ability for members of the team to coach and teach other members. There's often a high level of respect for each other. High-performing teams have maximum autonomy. So whether that's autonomy over how they work, over their technology stack, for example, one of the big advantages of services or microservices-based architectures is that you can give a greater level of technical autonomy to the team. They have a clear purpose. I once ran a team where we were building a platform that had to launch on the founder's 50th birthday. Now, that's like the hardest of hard deadlines ever, but with that to actually aim at, that sense of purpose meant that was the best team, the highest performing team I've ever been a part of. There's a high level of support in a high performing team, and a really, really clear sense of ownership. Whether that's the ownership of the product, ownership of the tools, ownership of the processes the teams use, ownership of the health of the team. High-performing teams often work with very, very clear principles. So a team charter can be really helpful here for aligning the principles of the team. And finally, there's a high level, a sense of diversity within a high-performing team. So whether this is diversity of gender, ethnicity, diversity of lived experience, it's really, really important. We're very focused in Bloom and Wild at the moment in improving the gender diversity of our technology team, and we're really seeing some benefits from it. So this is a good guide, I think, to elements and traits of a high-performing team. Right, that was a slight aside and a slight rock star rant, but hopefully you'll allow me to do that. Let's get back to our story. So we all agree, right, rock stars are bad. Let's have no more rock stars. Let's go and build high-performing teams. Well, the trouble is, post-pandemic, some kind of quite bad things have been happening. So if we zoom the interest rates graph in, what you can see is we're living in a cost of living crisis, which is fueled by coming out of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and some other macroeconomic reasons. And what that means is, it means that the whole funding model for our industry, and particularly the VC funding model, has changed, and has changed dramatically. So unless you work in AI, then the funding available to run and build startups and scale-ups has fundamentally dropped off a cliff. And this is bad. This is really bad because primarily, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, I'm sure you all know people that have been affected in the last 2 years. It's been a pretty rubbish couple of years, and lots of people, sadly, have lost their jobs, and lots of companies have failed, and lots of companies have tried to become profitable and maybe haven't succeeded, and are kind of like really hanging on for dear life. And when we're in these sorts of scenarios, we have to make some difficult decisions. And sometimes those difficult decisions mean we start prioritizing the hammer over the glue. And by that, I mean we start prioritizing folks that can cut code, folks that can deliver value, folks that might have a high blast radius, but we're kind of okay with that because of the situation that we're in. This might mean the rock stars are coming back. Now, I think those impacted, particularly when companies slim down, it's disproportionate. It's not, if you're a software engineer, you are usually more likely to retain your job, whereas if you're perhaps an Agile coach, certainly if you're an engineering manager, then you tend to be in a worse place. And so we've seen a trend of companies flattening their organizations, turning their engineering managers back into individual contributors. Now, this would be great, apart from the fact that engineering managers do lots of things that you actually need, one of them being performance management and coaching and career growth. And that does take time, and that does have an impact, and it's a force multiplier across teams. If we reduce the number of engineering managers any further, I think we're building up a problem. So I think we need to stop it. I think as our industry, we're actually building up a problem at the moment. Reducing our managerial capability reduces the oversight on our people, and it reduces the support that they get. And this isn't good. So we've got some things coalescing at the moment, right? So we've got less money in growth generally. Teams are not the size that we wanted them to be. And we've got fewer managers providing oversight and performance support to our engineers. This may mean that we're beginning to value the rock stars again. But there's something else that has an impact. So what this graph here shows is it shows lead engineer roles. And what you can see is there's a big uptick here, particularly around 2011, 2012. That's when the VC funding came in. We all started hiring lead engineers, and we carried on hiring lead engineers. Now, these engineers all need somewhere to go, right? And at the moment, there's not an awful lot of jobs around. So what are people doing in order to keep people engaged? I speculate what they're doing is giving them ever fancier job titles. And so we have this sort of situation now where we've got staff engineer, senior staff engineer, principal engineer, senior technical lead, architect, senior architect, partner engineer, distinguished engineer, fellow engineer. I could carry on. What this is a little bit about is just providing people somewhere to go, but it's going to come round and bite us. And it causes problems. So putting an overinflated job title on somebody generally is unfair on them if they don't necessarily have the capabilities. It will make it very hard for them to move on to another role. It makes it very hard for people to come in. Unless the more senior the role, the more you think you have to be very qualified for it. It puts under unnecessary pressure on younger, more junior engineers coming in. I wouldn't like to be a junior engineer at the moment. I think it's a very, very hard industry to get into. And the expectations on accelerating your career growth when you get into it are as tough as they've ever been, probably tougher. And it pushes up the expectations, it pushes up the salaries. It doesn't address the core need of somebody's career growth, it just gives them a new title. So let's not forget this, right? Unless you are in a big company which needs lots of job titles, You don't need lots of job titles. There are other ways to solve this problem. So as an example, this is actually the Bloom and Wild career path. So relatively simple. Sets out the expectations. We back this up with a growth framework. We have a couple of individual contributor tracks and a people management track. The individual contributor track goes senior enough that you're not forced into the managerial path just to progress. This should keep you happy up to at least 100 engineers, probably further. And there's another really, really important point when it comes to career paths and the, I guess, expectation of engineers. I don't care what you call yourself on LinkedIn. Call yourself like rockstar, wizard, engineer. Doesn't matter. It's actually about leveling you internally, because that's fair. So I think we've now got more things coalescing. So we've got less money and less growth. We've got fewer but more senior engineers. We've got fewer managers and less managerial oversight. And now we've got engineers with probably a slightly higher sense of self-importance walking around with fancier job titles. Maybe the rockstars are coming back. But there's one more thing that I think it's really important to be aware of. So, this would not be a conference presentation in 2024 without a generative AI section. So, if you're a generative AI skeptic, you can put your fingers in your ears for the next couple of minutes, but I think this stuff is important. So, irrespective of what you believe about the productivity improvements that generative AI will bring, there's lots of surveys floating around. There's lots of people saying, oh, actually, it's going to be better. And there's lots of people saying, no, actually, it's going to have no impact on software development at all. I believe it will be somewhere in the middle. We've rolled out GitHub Copilot for all our engineers at Bloom and Wild. We do see a productivity increase. We do see that it does actually add value in those areas that engineers perhaps don't have too much of an interest in, or are not frankly interesting. Generation of boilerplate code, generation of unit tests, understanding of areas of the code they're not familiar with. So we're seeing productivity improvements, and we're really generative AI is really at the beginning of its journey. It's in a hype cycle, but the reality is I don't think it's going to be like a Bitcoin hype cycle. So is it here to take all of our jobs? That's the question you've got to ask yourself, right? Now, I actually saw a conference presentation recently that made a very, very good analogy with the introduction of the printing press. So if you I was going to say if you can remember back to medieval times. Of course you can't, that's ridiculous. If you have read about what's happened in medieval times, you'll know that before the invention of the printing press, effectively what monks used to do is they used to make books by copying books, which is why there weren't very many books, even though there were quite a lot of monks. But when the printing press came in, those monks effectively shifted and became the owners of printing presses, and like the first printing barons, you might think. Some of them diversified into making delicious beer and stuff like that. So I guess the key point here is it's really early days. We don't know how Gen AI is going to impact our industry, but we don't really know the impact, but I think it's going to have an impact. Now, here's the impact I think it's going to have. So I'm sure some of you know theory of constraints. I'm sure some of you got opinions on whether theory of constraints is great or not, but broadly speaking, theory of constraints says find the bottleneck in your system, exploit it, so work out ways you can unlock capacity without making an additional investment. That doesn't work. Subordinate everything to it, so i.e. let your bottleneck set the pace of the rest of your system. That doesn't work. Make some investment, and then get on with your life. Find the next bottleneck. So if we apply this to a typical, let's say, software development value stream, so we have ideas come in on one side, we collect them, we shape them, we prioritize and we commit to them, we deliver them, and then we launch them, we learn, and the cycle repeats. So have you ever worked anywhere where there was a constraint here? Because I haven't. Have you ever worked anywhere where there was a constraint here? There's always a constraint here. That's why we have prioritization. It's why we have OKRs. It's why we do like Moscow stuff and forecasts and t-shirt sizing. Now, I think ultimately the rise of generative AI in software development is going to change that constraint. So, and this is why. So this shows you typical two-pizza team, right? So 6 to 8 engineers, maybe an engineering manager or a lead and a product manager. And the constraint here is always the number of engineers you have. So it's kind of like a natural balance to the amount of work that you put into the team. You can make little shifts in their productivity by investing in developer experience and stuff like that, but in reality, you're not really going to change the system that much. It's a little nudge. Now, let's say, just for hypothesis purposes, Gen AI comes along and makes those engineers twice as productive. So what you could do is you could keep the same number of teams, and everyone has more free time. As an aside, we have summer hours at Bloom & Wild. I'm currently not working. It's brilliant. I've got Friday afternoons off for the whole of July and August. But no, we're not going to do this, are we? Because we're all resource and capacity and budget constrained. So if we could make this happen, we'd do that, right? Because we only need one team to do the same amount of work if they're twice as productive. But what we've done if we do that is we've shifted the bottleneck. So the bottleneck stops being in your delivery capacity. It starts being in your shaping and or collection of ideas capacity. So you stress out your product function because suddenly they're having to work twice as hard. There is another way. And that other way is this. So how about over time, we shift that squad archetype? So as some of those engineers maybe move on, we replace them with product managers because those engineers that are in the team are able to work more productively. They're able to generate more value more quickly. So let's have fewer engineers per product person. Then we've restored that natural balance. And that's great because that means we've got more value and we've taken advantage of that productivity increase. However, we now have 5 things coalescing. So we have less money and less growth. Our teams are naturally smaller anyway. They've probably got more senior people in them. There's less managerial oversight because we've flattened our organizations. We've got folks running around with fancy job titles, like Senior Distinguished Fellow Engineer or something. And I speculate this may be the archetype of the future. So does that mean this is the archetype of the future? 3 rock stars and a product manager. Good luck, product manager, in that archetype, by the way. I don't know. It's all a bit depressing, actually, isn't it? I'm sorry. We're half an hour in, and I've just said it's all going to pot. All is not lost, right? We just need to prepare. And fortunately, I'll use Bloom & Wild as the example here. I think we've had an opportunity to prepare. So this is actually the Bloom & Wild engineering team. And there's a couple of things you can take from this Lego-oriented org slide. Every squad has an ampersand in it. That means they have a very broad surface area across both the product and the technology domain. And all of these squads are quite small. They're quite small because there's been a cost of living crisis. And we haven't been able to grow at the speed that we wanted to grow. Now, we spent last year moving the company around to being profitable, and we achieved that. And we're super, super proud that we've managed to do that. And we are beginning to grow again. But right now, we're very constrained. And some of these squads are actually more constrained than they look. So some of these squads own a product domain that crosses both our front end, our web app, and our back end. And they're composed of 2 front-end engineers and 2 back-end engineers. Now, I don't know about you, I've never worked anywhere where vertical slicing of stories works perfectly. We try, but what that means is, it means quite often you are getting horizontally sliced work. And that means you haven't got a team of 4, you've got a team of 2 and a team of 2. And that rapidly becomes a bottleneck. So what are we doing in order to make sure that we've got happy and high-performing teams? Firstly, we are focusing on the traits that I mentioned earlier. So trust, a mix of seniority, respect, autonomy, purpose, making sure that there's a high level of support and ownership, clear principles, and we're really investing in improving the gender diversity of our team. There's 4 other things we're doing, and that's what I wanted to talk to you to conclude this presentation. So we're looking more at T-shaped skill sets. We've been experimenting with a technique called inner source. We're investing heavily in communities and shared learning. So let's talk about T-shaped skill sets first. So for those squads where you've got 2 front-end engineers and 2 back-end engineers, and never the 2 will meet, they'll face off across the API. You joke. Remember the example I gave earlier of the rockstar that built the middleware? It happens. So that acts as a big constraint. And so what we're doing is we're shifting our hiring priorities to look more for engineers that either have the capability or the desire to work in a more full stack way. So full stack here means effectively that they may have a deeper knowledge area, either in front-end development or back-end development, but they have the desire and the ability, and we can train them to become productive in both front-end or back-end. And what that does is it helps to soften that 2+2 constraint. Now, we don't want our squads to be entirely composed of generalists, full-stack generalists. If we do that, we are not going to be investing enough in the long-term health of our systems because we're not going to have the experts. But roughly speaking, a squad that's able to be, say, a 50-50 mix between those different archetypes is one where you're balancing long-term health against flexibility. And when we hire these folks, it's often really, 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 really tempting just to hire for this. Particularly, 2015, it was very tempting to hire for that. Because you're like, oh, there's an engineer, they want to join, get them. If you optimize only for this, it's a mistake. So some things you want to be looking for, and some things we look for. The cultural impact. So what's the cultural add that somebody can bring to our organization? Not necessarily the cultural fit. If we only look for cultural fit, we're going to look for identikit versions of the people we already have. But what can somebody bring and what can somebody add to our culture? How do they communicate? Communication is a very underrated trait of a good software engineer. Look for this in an interview. You have to look, and you should look for their capability. Like, don't go looking for somebody who's amazing at communication, but has no ability to work, in a Ruby on Rails monolith when you have a Ruby on Rails monolith. That would be a challenge. Look for somebody who prioritizes and is effective at collaboration. And shows a bit of compassion. I think that's really, really important. And then value kindness. One of our values is care wildly. And kindness, I think, is a massively underrated trait of a good engineer. If you want to take a picture of this, by the way, I'll take all the great bits away. It's a lot easier. Don't worry, you'll get these slides afterwards. So when you're looking for engineers like this, don't just optimize for what's easy to test for. So you want in your hiring process to be specific and reasonable. Don't go looking for rock stars, ninjas, gurus, wizards, stud JavaScript developers. Look for curiosity and look for problem solving. That's what you're really trying to get at. A good engineer that is curious, can solve problems, and can effectively communicate and collaborate is somebody that's successful in a high-performing team. And you're looking for what they can add to your culture, not whether they fit necessarily in your culture. And that's where having solid values in a company can really help. So don't just look for technical capability. Even if you've had a role open for 6 months and you just want to get somebody in, it's a mistake. You'll build rock stars. But what about the folks that are already in your team? And this is a challenge we have at the moment in particular. People aren't moving around quite as much as they used to because there aren't the roles to move around to. So first, it's about being honest about opportunities. So I think particularly for folks in people management positions, if you're not doing the stupid thing of flattening your organization and trying to turn all your engineering managers into engineering managers who also code and do performance management and do the hiring and somehow have invented time machines so that they're able to do it, you need to be honest about opportunities. So if you're a people manager, there needs to be people to manage. So that's a bit of a kind of bums on seats. There needs to be available seat in order for you to be able to do your job. But if you're an individual contributor, there's no need, particularly in your for less senior roles, to constrain that track. So saying I can only have 4 senior engineers in my organization, for example, is a mistake. You block people's growth. But if somebody really wants to progress, think about other ways that you can keep them engaged. There may be more interesting work and more aligned work that they could be focused on. They might want more time to learn and more time to grow. Find ways to do that in order to maintain engagement. Maybe you can think about increasing the span of somebody's role. And think about how you can build and connect them, particularly with communities that may be outside of your organization, particularly if your team's quite small. So the second thing we've been doing that I think really helps kind of build that flexibility when teams are small is something called inner source. So inner source came from the concept of open source. So Linus Torvalds' way of working for Git, but it was a term coined by Tim O'Reilly, that O'Reilly, back in 2001. And what it is, it's about introducing additional flexibility to your teams. And you do this by establishing effectively an open source way of working inside your teams and inside your code bases. And it's a great way of improving ownership, improving accountability, and reducing knowledge hoarding and single points of failure. How does it work? So let's say we have 2 teams. So we have squad A and squad B. Looks like I'm in squad B. And they have 2 code bases. And if you need to do something, if squad A needs to do something, they change their code base. And if squad B needs to do something, they change their code base. All cool, right? Everyone gets on with stuff? High levels of autonomy? Everyone happy? What happens if a cross-cutting initiative comes along? Well, suddenly what you've done is you've tied these 2 squads together. Because let's say squad A needs to make a change but needs something from squad B. Then the only option squad A has, because they can't go in and change squad B's code, they have to wait for squad B. And so what you end up with is you end up with excessive wait time, and you also end up with an excessive coordination overhead, because often to try and run a project like this, and particularly at scale, let's say there are 7 or 8 squads, you need to put representatives of all 7 or 8 of those squads in a meeting probably once a week to give their progress updates and status updates because you've tied the whole system together in a bit of a knot. There is another way. And that way is this. So if we establish the concept of contributors and maintainers, so a maintainer, so like this little fella over here, he's accountable to his engineering manager for the maintainability, the scalability, the availability, the testability, the code health of their technical domain. So the technical domain owned by squad B. But if somebody in squad A wants to make a change, instead of waiting for squad B, we introduce the concept of a contributor. And a contributor is just somebody who can change a code base. They can change any code base. So contributor can come and change the code base of squad B. They can make a change over there. Now, the key dynamic here is the contributor must get their changes approved by the maintainer. The best way to do this is through pairing and shared regular review. And so what you've now done is we've removed a bottleneck, we've added flexibility, we've added a learning opportunity, we've added a review opportunity. We've stopped that knowledge and information hoarding. Now, some quick learnings from inner source. There are some anti-patterns to be aware of. The first anti-pattern I will call all the code at the last minute. So let's say a contributor in squad A needs to do a piece of work in squad B's code base. They make multiple commits until they've got a huge PR, and then on Friday afternoon, they slack the maintainer in squad B and they say, would you mind reviewing this? And maintainer opens the PR up and goes, what the? No way, this isn't happening. And they reject it. And the contributor then goes, well, there's a small problem here because we need this feature in production this afternoon because marketing is starting a major campaign tomorrow which relies on it being there. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to escalate this, and then the maintainer effectively gets forced to take something into their ownership that they don't agree with. Equally, on the other side, there's a bit of an anti-pattern which may be the contributor regularly reviews, daily ideally, with the maintainer, and the maintainer goes, oh, no, I wouldn't really do it like that. Okay, you change it. Or I wouldn't do it like that either. Or like that, and you just get back and forwards and back and forwards and back and forwards. Equally, if you don't give your maintainers time to maintain, i.e. you have them 100% on the backlog, again, you have yourself a problem. But if you get it right, with early pairing and daily review, what you get is increased flexibility and you remove bottlenecks in small teams. Now, it's not free. Nothing's free, right? So you are trading off efficiency for flexibility here. So your contributors are not going to be as productive in Squad B's code base if they are in Squad A, but they will begin to learn and they will begin to get more productive. It takes time and capacity for the maintainer to be an effective maintainer, and you need them to be an effective maintainer, or your code base health will suffer. But what you're doing is you're getting more flexibility, you're getting more knowledge sharing, and you're helping to drive out and exclude rockstar type behaviors through your ways of working. So what else stops the rockstars? Well, I think communities stops the rockstars. So I'm a very, very firm believer in communities of practice. We have communities of practice in Bloom and Wild for all of our different code bases. And this is really where like-minded folks get together with time to get together to support each other, learn from each other, train and support each other. And they're great at anchoring knowledge, value, and enabling coaching. Emily Webber has written huge amounts about communities, and I would really, really recommend, if you haven't got communities where you work, read that book, read her website, think about communities. And these are even more important. When teams are going to be smaller, then folks are not going to get everything they need from within their team. We need to find better ways of gluing people together. Now, whether that is inside a company or equally, whether it's making it easier to discover and engage with external communities. It's really, really important for alignment and growth. As is learning. So learning and training stops the information hoarding. So at Bloom and Wild, we're looking at things like shared learning goals. So encouraging people to share their learning goals outside of their team, and then pairing people up where they've got shared interests, so they can support each other as they learn. Making sure that we're providing time and we're providing space for learning is really important. You won't get a learning culture if you run your team or your squad at 100% allocation, because with the best will in the world, people actually have lives and like to do other things at the weekend. You shouldn't expect them to learn at the weekend if what they're learning is going to benefit you. As much as possible, we try and tie things back to actually doing. And we encourage teaching of what's been learnt, because I'm a firm believer in the Feynman technique, which is if you can't teach it, particularly to a child, then you don't actually know it. So we try and encourage that too. And one way we do this is through a concept called learning days. So our concept of learning days is this is a bookable day that anyone can book, and so you can go in our HR system and say, I'm having a learning day, and you agree it with your manager, and then you use your learning day to learn something interesting to you that you think will help your career. And when you're on a learning day, it's a bit like you're at a conference, so you're not really interruptible. You're actually there to learn. Now, and as much as possible, we try and pair people up for these and get people to pair up, learn things together. Sharing is caring. And we don't expect people to kind of feed back and present back what they've learned if they don't want to. But if they do, it's a really, really valuable way of working. So the really important thing with this is it makes learning okay. It makes the space to say, I am learning safe. And that's really important. Okay. Now, there's a little bit of a trap that I want to explain and hopefully help you avoid when it comes to how we reward the right behaviors. So I don't know about you, I have been in this situation in the past where I've had a senior executive come to me and they've said, hey Steve, how's the team going? And I go, well, it's going okay actually. Yeah, we've done this, this and this. How productive is the team? And you're like, oh, don't know. I need a productivity measure for the CEO. I'll just pick something like, I don't know, what's easy to measure? Lines of code, that's easy to measure. You are my audience. Arguably, even velocity is a bit of a dangerous one. But the problem if you start measuring stuff like that is you are going to start making your rock stars look good. And that's not good. What you want to be thinking about is how you can reward all of these behaviors. So it's not just about coding, it's about that team and that cultural impact. And the best way you can do this and align this and level this is by a fully transparent growth or performance framework. So this is actually a snapshot out of the Bloom and Wild one. I would say if you do not have a growth framework where you work, I would very, very strongly recommend you advocate for one. So we split ours into 4 different pillars. So one is expertise. How good are you at doing the core aspects of your job? But then how do you actually go about getting stuff done? So how do you actually go about your day? How do you work within your squad? What responsibility do you take? What's the impact? And how do you help the squad improve as a team? And then how do you communicate? What leadership do you show? How broad is that leadership? Is your leadership just within your squad? Or are you playing a key part, for example, in a community of practice? Encouraging all these behaviors and leveling people to these behaviors helps you avoid just focusing on lines of code. And when it comes to measuring things, metrics have been very, very, let's say, popular. I think they're good. I think measuring how deployment frequency, how quickly you're deploying value to production, how long it takes for an idea to get to production, how often you break production, and then how quickly you can restore production, are actually really, really, really valuable measures. But they're very much on how, not who. And fortunately, cleverer people than me, particularly Nicole Forsgren, have more recently adjusted and moved on from DORA to SPACE. Now, SPACE has been around for a little while, but we've been using this to guide our approach to measurement in Bloom and Wild. And it focuses on 5 different areas. So firstly, satisfaction and well-being. So we use twice yearly health check to measure the fulfillment and the happiness of the team. Performance. So, for example, what's the mean time between failure, or the mean time to recovery in production? They're performance metrics. Or what impact is the work we're doing having on conversion on the site? That's a performance metric. We look at deployment frequency as an activity metric, because how quickly and how regularly, more importantly, frequently you can deploy to production is a really, really good way of saying, effectively, how quickly am I able to deliver value? What's the constraint? We look at communication. This is mainly gathered through our health check. And then we look at efficiency and flow. And this is really where we're looking at cycle time. So, to conclude, this isn't going to last forever, right? But it took until 2011 for the effects of the financial crisis in 2008 to really start to benefit our industry. I think the days of free money are over. I don't think we're going back to this. This is an anomaly. And if we're not careful and considered about how we staff, grow, and reward our teams, I think we are going to end up with more rock stars. We're going to end up with more job title inflation, and we're going to make it harder for good people to succeed in our industry. Because what changes here, folks, this slide's mainly there because I made a Lego Charles Darwin. So, I think the best unit of delivery is the team. Teams in the future may get smaller. When you're hiring and staffing your teams, focus on all the C's. Consider T-shapes and consider inner source. Prioritize and focus on communities and focus on learning. And reward the right things. Don't let the rock stars back, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We have time for one intelligent question.
No pressure there. Does anyone have a question? I'm going to go with this gentleman who put his hand up just before.
Very quick one. You mentioned about Copilot, your evaluation of Copilot demonstrates that people are more productive as well. How did you measure that?
Stephen, can you say the question again, please?
Yes, so the question was, we've started using Copilot. How have we assessed the success of Copilot, effectively? Very much through the set of metrics, particularly the activity metrics I mentioned around the space model. So, and also, so they're the quantitative metrics. We've also looked at qualitative feedback. So as we've rolled it out, we've regularly fed back through surveys just to say, how are you finding it? Yeah, and also I think just how many engineers are actually using it, I think is also a really, really good metric.
We're out of time. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, folks.